what I'm going to be talking to you today about is some of the research I've been doing over the past few years with quite a few collaborators around the world about the early settlers in the Americas. So the first lot of people that entered the Americas, and what this skeleton that we found a couple of years ago actually means and everything. So I will get started because there's a bit to get through. Here we go. So first things first, this is just my little warning for everybody. I will be showing pictures of a human skeleton, a real one. The one behind me isn't real, don't worry. So this is just my little pre-warning at the beginning. If you don't like looking at skeletons, then you may want to just have your eyes closed for the entirety of it. But anyway, what we have, so this is just a little bit of background information, just to really put everything in context. So we had like this very main, we had this idea of human expansion from many years ago, and the last continents that actually were populated by humans were the Americas. It was North, Central, South America. They were the last ones. And for quite a long time, we thought that the first people that arrived were around about that 13,500 years ago, and we known it as like Clovis first model. It was named Clovis first because of this, this, as the picture shows, this type of fluted blade, which they dubbed as a Clovis blade. And that was kind of like the technological tool of that time. Sadly, however, that got massively debunked. There we go. That got massively debunked quite a few years ago, and we actually managed to find an archaeological site all the way down in Chile for the site of Monteverde. And it's actually dated between 33 and 14,500 years ago. So it completely kiboshes, it completely goes against this idea of this Clovis first model. So this is normally the area that we are working in now is something called pre-Clovis. So in terms of time periods, we are kind of looking at around about this 10 to 15,000 years and a lot older. So that's what we have. So we normally find a lot of stuff in North America, and we find a lot of stuff, well, North America being Canada and the USA, and we find a lot of stuff like here in Monteverde in Chile, a lot of stuff down in South America as well. But there's very little actually going on in Central America. So this is actually from a site in Mexico, not the one I'm talking about at all, because sadly this didn't hold any human remains, but it was an actual site of human occupation. They managed to find these lovely, we call them lithics, so stone tools that predate Clovis technology and everything like that. And this was actually found central Mexico, but quite above where Mexico City is. So we're talking like 100 kilometers north of Mexico City. We had this lovely site where we managed to find it. Sadly, however, because it's one of the early sites that we have, we've got no comparison to compare it against and to try and understand more. But because of the amount of stone tools that we saw, it's kind of, it's under the impression that this cave site that was in, oh God, pronunciation, Chiquijite, was a running site. So it was under a lot of occupation. It was constantly being used. So that was that, literally very brief about the stone tools and archaeology, because I'm not a lithics person. I fully understand things when I've got a human skeleton in front of me. I understand context a lot better, and it's a lot nicer to see. So yes, the skeletons. So some of the most important skeletons that we have found in North America, a lot of people would have heard of Kennewick Man. He caused up a huge controversy quite a few years ago regarding its ancestry and geographic origin, if it was Native American or not, or if it wasn't, was it more European? So yeah, you can literally Google Kennewick Man and you can read the rebuttals and the arguments that happen around this skeleton. But Kennewick was dated at around about 8,500 years old. So that kind of is, it's super old. It's quite nice. This is what we kind of like to see. And Kennewick was found in Washington State, in the south part of the state in America. And then we've got his body, which was found in Spirit. It's known as the Spirit Cave because it was found in a place called Spirit Cave, which is around about 10,000 years old. Now, something that we see with both of these individuals is, and I'll get onto it further down, is their type of skull morphology, so the shape of their skulls. We found that they were very similar in their shape. We found that they were quite long in the face and long this way as well. So quite long in the face, and we're like, right, okay, this kind of fits this idea that the first people that kind of came across into the Americas had this long face coming over from the Straits. I've now forgotten what it's called, but basically coming from like Russia, Siberia, going across. So, and then we've got the skeletons from South America as well. So this is Luzia. She is 11,000 years old, and she was found in Brazil. And she is absolutely fantastic in that, because it's quite a lot of the face that we actually get to work with. There have been quite a number of facial reconstructions of her as well, but she is the oldest skeleton in South America, which is beautiful. It's great, and they've got quite a few skeletons, but it mainly seems to be Brazil that has all of these skeletons. Then we go into more of my research area, my research country, so to speak, which is Mexico. So there have been quite a few skeletons that have been found. We call it pre-ceramic Mexico, mainly because it was pre-pottery. And we found around about 5 skeletons in basically around the Mexico City area. The most famous of these is Peñon 3, also known as Peñon Woman, and they're all around about 12,000 years old. Now, all of these skulls that I've kind of like mentioned very briefly, they all have that very typical long face. Nice long face. So we kind of came up with this idea that, okay, so individuals with a long, narrow skull, so these can be dubbed like paleo-american. Okay, so these are going to be the first wave of individuals entering the continent. Anything now that we see, as we see a lot of like Native Americans, they've got modern day Native Americans, they've got much rounder faces than this like long, gaunt type of structure. So we say that anything with a long face is paleo-american, that's part of the first initial wave. Anything with this rounded face, then we normally dub them as being Amerindian, and they normally came a lot later, and normally with the mix of the Spanish Inquisition and everything that happened there. We then have another site, so just on the bottom of the US, we've got the Channel Islands in California, which is also one of my other sites that I work at. And these are actually a lot younger. So this is around about 3,000 to 4,000 years old. But again, they've got this very long, structured face. So what this kind of told us was kind of like this little bit of a pathway, this migration pathway going from north to the south, and then kind of hugging the coast, the Pacific coast, as they came down. Then came the Yucatan in Mexico, which threw up a huge curveball in everything, essentially. So there's been a lot of ongoing investigations in the Yucatan, especially in Tulum, which is part of the area called Quintana Roo. And they've got a lot of underwater cave systems called cenotes, which have been flooded since the last glacial maximum with the sea level change and stuff like that. And what you've got is you've got like these labyrinths of underwater caves that are only now slowly being discovered by divers in the area. So they'll go down, they'll be teaching people diving, and this is what they'll kind of find. And what happened is they ended up finding quite a few skeletons down there that were actually quite old. So these are all pre-ceramic skeletons from the Tulum area in the Yucatan. So these are the main ones that we've been dealing with. Najaron, Las Palmas, El Pit, and Muknal. They're absolutely gorgeous specimens because they've essentially been lying in water for 8,000 years. And the preservation of them is absolutely fantastic. They're really beautiful to handle. And this last one, which I've labeled D here, this is actually the oldest human skeleton in North, Central, South America. And her name is Naya. Sadly, she's not really part of the analysis because they haven't released any of the data for her. So I'm kind of stuck not analyzing her, but she is around about 15,000 years old. So she is very important, but very difficult to get hold of to actually analyze. But the reason why I'm here today is to talk about the most recent discovery that we had, named Ishel, or the official name is Chan Hol 3, because it was found in the cave system called Chan Hol. So that was kind of like that labyrinth section that they were found in. And yeah, so this is a picture of one of our divers, Geronimo. And he was going down there with a couple of friends, so Eugenia and a couple of others, doing an exploration dive because they had found skeletons along the way. I don't know if it may be a bit too small for you to all see, but there's a little map of the Chan Hol cave system, and you've got 3 stars. You've got CH1, CH2, and CH3. And because they had found the first Chan Hol skeleton, they were like, well, what about if we go a bit deeper? We might be able to find something. And then they found Chan Hol 2, another 500 meters in that cave system. And then from another 200 meters in from that, they found Chan Hol 3. And she was just lying there. She was just lying there, essentially. And absolutely beautiful, fantastic preservation. It took around about, I would say 8 to 10 months, I think, to actually preserve the skeleton outside of the water, so you could actually handle it without it crumbling into nothing and stuff like that. So we did have Ishel. Oh, before we do that, one of the beauties of this skeleton is how she was found. So it was weird because her cranium, her skull, was actually found on a limestone bed that had a stalagmite underneath it. So it kind of resembled like a pillow. And that's where her head was laid on this, and then the rest of the body was kind of laid out as if it was kind of like used as a pillow, and she was laid out in bed. It's kind of like a mini mortuary practice. We have no idea if that's true, but that's how she was found, and that's the story that I like to tell because I think it's quite nice. So this was the skeleton that we had, and fantastically preserved considering everything else that was around in that site. There was other things within the area like pedicule, so it's kind of like rodents and stuff like that, which had butchery marks on, so they were actually being used for meat consumption. But that's kind of like the place that she was found in, and that's what we had. So when I got to Mexico, I was basically told we had this skeleton, and we need you to do some analysis. We need you to tell her who she is, what happened to her, how X, Y, and Z, who, what, why, where, when. So I did my analysis and going through, and I came across several things that stuck out like a sore thumb. So as we see in pictures A and B, you can see it more so in B, there's this line with a hole in it. Now that's not a normal line with a hole in it. You don't normally get those in schools. They're normally made by external things. And considering the rest of the skeleton and how the decomposition happened and the taphonomic processes, this was kind of like, okay, so this looks like it's potentially sharp force trauma. So something has cut the back of her head all the way through into the skull. Luckily, though, we do see signs of healing of this. So it's something that she actually did survive. So she's a fighter. In the picture that I have in A, it's very difficult to see, but there is kind of like this, there's a hole in the side of her head. It doesn't go all the way through, but it's kind of like a mound. And I have no idea what it is, but it shouldn't be there. So I'm talking with some people in Mexico to actually get her cranium, her skull, CT scanned. So I can actually look inside the bone and see what is actually happening here. Is this healing that's happening? You know, kind of like a callus that you get when you break a bone and you get a bump across it. And we're seeing this healing process happen. Who knows? I've got to wait for the extra information for that, sadly. In the image that we see here in C, you can see like kind of like this little like hole that's in kind of like, this is a vertebral body. So we actually see this is part of the spine. And this hole is actually called a Schmoll's node. And it's basically the disc has slightly perforated and it's just bumped in, completely asymptomatic, doesn't really hurt that much. So it's fine. We had small sharp force trauma to the rest of the skull. So you might be able to see next to this in image D, this very, very nice clean slice in the bone. And then E and F, we actually came across some dental pathology. So this is very painful. They had massive dental caries, massive dental cavities that completely ate away at the teeth. So there would have been quite a lot of pain just dealing dentally. I did go a little bit further into the analysis of these traumas and what they could kind of mean and everything. So I came up with a couple of ideas, some theories that we're waiting. Once we get the medical imaging, we can actually say yes or no to what some of it is. But one of them is kind of like this idea of trepanning, which is like boring holes into skulls to release cranial pressure. And it was used as a medical treatment for quite a few centuries. And I managed to find a description in Kaufman et al. Of something called a fusiform groove, which is where they would take kind of like that stone tool, that sharp stone tool, and they would just grind it side to side until they've perforated through. And that could potentially be the cause of this. What we also saw on the back of the skull was this, I call it like mottling effect on the back of the skull, and it messed, as in, it's very difficult to try and actually understand what it is. So part of it was, okay, we could be actually seeing like a very strong type of infection that's happening here. So this is why we may have that trepanning, you know, to relieve some of that infection. Or it could have been as the case that I found here, they had an infection which resulted in something called osteomyelitis. Don't Google it, it's disgusting to see. And that was a result of somebody being scalped. And since that we have these sharp entrances on the back of the skull, it is always a possibility that this may be the case. Again, very difficult to actually be able to pinpoint and say this is definitely what's happened, because this happened over 10,000 years, well, 10,000 years ago. So Yeah, who knows? But it's worth thinking about. With the mottling of the back of the skull, though, it did come up as other possible things as well. So maybe instead of that scalping incident, it may have been caused by something called trichonemal disease. So this is like a bacterial infection, which is normally related to stuff like syphilis, which we've all heard of. And it could weirdly be kind of like a early version of syphilis or a slightly different trichonemal disease called Yaw's disease, because they manifest and look very similar to each other, especially in the tertiary stages. So the top left image is of Ishel, whilst the other images are kind of like comparative images of stages of tertiary syphilis. So very late stages of where the bacteria has actually started to eat away at the cranium and cause massive lesions as well. So it wouldn't have been pretty. So I'm a bit unsure as to what it is. A lot of medical imaging would help with this because you'd then be able to see internal structures and stuff like that. It'd be really nice to see. So that was her story, as in Ishel, I estimated her to be a female that died at around about the age of 30 to 35 years. So she didn't live a long life, and towards the end, it looked like a very difficult life as well. So it is sad to see, but she can definitely tell us a lot more. So she lived a very difficult life, but the answers and more questions she actually brings to what life was like. So the next part of what I was asked to do was to understand what her skull overall could tell us in terms of migration pathways, what routes they may have potentially have taken. So those in the business of skull morphology are normally tasked with this idea of paleo-american morphology. As I was saying, paleo-american was the first wave of individuals. And then we've got the Amerindian morphology, which were kind of like the later subset of people that arrived. And these are just images of what people said. So they said paleo-american with this long, narrow faces, which is called dolichocephalic skulls or leptoprosthepic skulls. And then you've got the rounded faces, which is called brachiocephalic skulls. So this was the area that we kind of looked at and this is how it was normally always studied. If it was long, then it was deemed as old. If it was round, it was deemed to be more modern. But sadly, I also dabble in biostatistics. So I do a lot more than just simple stuff like this. So what I did at first is I got hold of data that gave me these indices and these information that would tell me if they are long and narrow or rounded. And I graphed it to see what we were dealing with. So this is one of the things that I found. So the big star is where Ishel lives, Chan Hol 3. And she seems to be in between these two dotted lines. So anything that is deemed to be less than 75 of a cranial index, then they are said to have this long, narrow face. And we can see that our good friend Kennewick Man and Spirit Cave that I mentioned earlier, they are present in being long in the face. Peñon 3 and the Mexican samples that I shown earlier, and these blue ones are from South America. Then we've got this middle section, which this middle section doesn't quite make sense. So this is normally called as mesocephalic. So this is kind of like middle skull. It's not long and narrow, but it's not quite round. It's somewhere in the middle. And we're seeing quite a lot of individuals from specifically the Yucatan area being mesocephalic. So we've got Las Palmas, Muknal, Oyo Negro, otherwise known as Naya, and Chan Hol 3, so Ishel. Oh. So like, right, okay, it's a bit odd that there's so many of these individuals in this middle category, and barely any of my sample, I only had 2 people that were deemed to be brachiocephalic, rounded in the face. And we're like, right, okay, human variation, we can deal with 2, but having quite a large sample in this middle category kind of goes against the idea that if it's long and narrow, it's old. So I then did a lot more analysis, and I took a lot of measurements on the skull, on all the skulls, and I performed some very complicated statistics, which I won't go into because nobody wants to hear statistics on a Tuesday evening. And this is just essentially looking at just variation, you know, and if they can kind of cluster people to where they need to be. So this was just an indication of the samples I had that were across Mexico. So the ones in green, this is from another cave site called Coahuila, and it is a cave site in the northeastern Mexico, in the middle of the desert. And they are kind of described as nomadic. So still hunter-gatherers, not really dealing with agriculture. And then we had in red, these are all the ones from central Mexico. So Peñon 3, Metro Valderas, stuff like that. Again, the super old stuff, around about 13 years. And then we've got the 1,000 years from Coahuila. And then Ishel kind of popped herself very similar to the 1,000-year-old. I was like, okay. But what does that tell me? It doesn't really tell me a lot. So what I did is that I then went one step further, and I looked at a much larger sample. And what this sample was, is that I looked at anything I could really get my hands on from the US in terms of old. And so what I managed to get hold of was central Mexico, which was down at the bottom, which is around about 12,000 years. Individuals from the Californian coast, from the Chan Hol Islands, around about 4 to 5. Colombian Lagoa Santa is Brazilian, and super old Colombian. They all kind of belong to this low part of this graph, because all of these individuals had this long and narrow face, and they're all kind of clustered to one side for each other. Then I had the other individuals from the Yucatan that I managed to get data for, and Chan Hol 3, Ishel, and they are clustered very close to each other. Essentially, they are the same cluster. A lot further up, kind of off doing their own thing. We're like, right, okay. And then I got some samples which are kind of like post contact with Europe, going into colonial America and stuff like that, and they're still vastly different from those individuals. So it was like, oh, so the people from the Yucatan really sectioned themselves off in how they appeared and how they what they looked like. So because of this, we had to, the team that I worked with, we kind of had to go back to basics and had to rethink some of our theories, our ideas, and everything like that. And we're like, are we going to have to expand on our cranial typologies instead of it solely being long and narrow is old and rounded is super young? Do we actually have to incorporate this middle type of skull, this not quite long, not quite round, in with the old as well, since the oldest skeletons actually have this middle morphology? So that's kind of like one of our thought processes. Are we going to have to expand it to have this idea? So then we expanded a little bit further with some possible routes and everything. So we came up with the idea of saying, okay, so instead of it being paleo-american is long and narrow or dolichocephalic, we've split kind of like the term paleo-american into 2. So we've got paleo-american 1, because everybody that we found with this long and narrow have stuck towards this Pacific coast. As soon as they've entered from Alaska, going into Canada, then going all the way down, they've stuck with this long and narrow face. Whilst paleo-american too, we can say is mesocephalic in this term of they are not rounded, they're not long, they're in the middle. And we're finding them along the Yucatan, and potentially we're finding them in the south of Florida. So, which tells us that we had expansion into the Americas was a lot quicker than we ever really anticipated. For them to get across the continent and then go down, they must have entered a lot sooner than what we originally had thought. So that was everything kind of regarding Ishel, and the amount of questions she's caused is great, because it just means more work for us, and I get to deal with her for longer and everything like that. So our next steps with Ishel is, again, this medical imaging of her skull, so I can kind of understand a little bit more of what's happening with that mottling effect and what's happening on the side of the skull as well. And we're also incorporating new skeletons that are constantly being found, or I've managed to finally get hold of data for it. So this is a little sneak peek of some of the work that I've been doing, dealing with another old skeleton from Mexico called Tláhuac, which is found near central Mexico and Mexico City. And she is 9,500 years old. So she's a little bit younger than Ishel. But she has a completely different morphology than everybody else. She's a lot more similar to these new people, these rounded faces. She's not mesocephalic at all. She's not in this middle. She's definitely a rounded face. So we have no real idea what we're going to do with this. So this is quite a large project, as you can imagine. We are bringing in a lot more skeletal analysis. We're currently working on, well, we've got permission, we just need the actual permits to conduct work in Costa Rica, Guatemala, Cuba, Florida, and also, as of a couple of weeks ago, Ecuador as well, to analyze their skeletons and to kind of put them on the map to see what's happening in Central America in terms of migration. And we're also going to be trying to folding in molecular analysis like DNA, trying to get hold of some ancient DNA and actually try and perform the analysis with everything I found with the actual skeletons, their morphology, and also looking at the material culture that we have obviously found, like the cave site in central Mexico, where we had those one of the oldest cave sites, stuff like that. We can actually try and build that into the model, and also looking at megafauna, so big mammals and stuff like that, because they would have moved in a very similar way we would have moved. So we can also use megafauna as a way of tracking migration. So the best way for us to actually do anything is to combine it all together and not just do a separate analysis like I've done. So that is the next steps of this. And this is just so you can see the team that I worked with. So we had Jeronimo, who was our diver, and he is also our lab manager in Mexico. This is where the skeleton is stored. We've got Dr. Sarah Stinisbeck. She's our megafauna expert. She is an actual expert in ancient ground sloths and stuff like that. Professor Sylvia Gonzalez, she's a geoarchaeologist. So she is an expert in how to date these old things. So carbon dating and stuff like that, that is her specialty. And she also understands quite a lot regarding the first settlers in America. We then have Arturo Gonzalez, who's one of the archaeologists and other anthropologists who works on the site, and Wolfgang Stinisbeck, who is also another geologist who can date materials super well. Stuff that when we can't rely on radiocarbon dating, we normally go to Wolfgang to ask to date, because he knows of the very fancy techniques that cost lots of money. So that is everything that I have. So thank you very much. And before I forget, I need to put this slide up. So yes, if you enjoy your break, but if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat.
That's great.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Sam. Sounds like there's some exciting things ahead anyway, of discovering new discoveries. So, yep, as we said, we're going to have a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back at about 1:45 to resume with the Q&A session. So, yeah, see you all in a few minutes.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, we've started off with Julia Galvin's got a question for you, Sam. And she's asking us whether or not the tooth decay suggests a lot of starch in the diet, and is there any way to analyse for this, and also the jaw shape and connection with chewing.
So when we first had the skeleton, we had so many hopes and dreams. Sadly, because, so I'm answering one of the other ones first, because of the fact that she was in a submerged cave for so long, we did actually take a sample of the tooth to try and get some isotopes to get an idea of her diet, to see if it was more marine based, if it was more plant based, or if it was more terrestrial meat based. Sadly, nothing. It was so degraded that we couldn't get any information from it. So that was a shame. But yeah, like with a lot of like modern day with cavities and stuff like that, it is normally associated with a lot of sugary or stuff that has a lot of sugar, glucose based and stuff like that, that's going to slowly eat away at the teeth. So that is always going to be a known fact, that they would have had a lot of starch. And because it's in a very tropical area, we do see that in a lot of the skeletons. All the other skeletons from the Yucatan as well also have a lot of cavities. So there is a relationship with that. So there is a lot of starchy foods being eaten, but sadly, I haven't got the chemical analysis to prove it. Just some rotting teeth, sadly. And then with the jaw shape with connection with chewing, she's quite gracile with her muscle markers and stuff like that. So
I was going to say, do you want to just explain what that means, Sam?
Oh
we've
yeah,
got a mixed audience.
Sorry, yeah. Gracile, so it's like a lot of oh god, a lot of like not like heavy set, robust, very soft features and stuff like that. So there wasn't like massive muscle attachments that we could see on the skeleton. However, so not necessarily linked with the chewing, but it is kind of linked with the chewing. On one of the teeth, it was worn down at an angle, like complete angle. We're talking around about 40 degree. And the only reason you would get that is through, especially at that time, is running stuff through your teeth. So one of the ways in which you would sort through all the fibrous material to make ropes and stuff like that is that you would take leaves and you would run it through your teeth to actually be able to break it down enough to then turn into something usable like rope. So yeah, her teeth were messed up. So that also wouldn't have helped with the cavities, because you're then left with chunks missing. But yeah, she was very petite in that regard, so we couldn't really look at that, but she was definitely a worker.
Certainly a survivor as well.
Oh yeah, she was yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so talking about surviving, Matthew's asking, is there any surviving descendants of these mysterious settlers? Perhaps one of the tribes living in South America.
So
I suppose that's more bringing in the DNA stuff that you're planning, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So that is something that we're really wanting to try and figure out, to see what the hell is happening. Where did these people go? So we have taken samples from Ishel. Again, there's nothing there. Preservation is physically is okay, but any molecular analysis, it is completely washed and it is gone. Even using the innermost part of a tooth, which is one of the most protected areas, we can't get DNA from the skeleton. However, we've managed to get some DNA from other skeletons in Mexico. So maybe not those from the Yucatan, but other skeletons from like Mexico City, like Tláhuac, who's only 500 years older, who's a very completely different face shape. We've managed to get the DNA from her. And she's actually linked to Kennewick man. Not linked as in familial, she's not like a long lost relative, but they share similar genetics, which means they definitely had some links way back in the past and they came through. So we are hoping when we are building more of this DNA profile that we are going to be talking with a lot of Native American tribes and stuff like that to kind of link them back to their past. So past their oral history and stuff like that. So yeah, we're trying.
I was going to say it's like finding a needle in a haystack, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah. So why do you think the preservation of this particular skull is so good in just water?
I put that personally down to Geronimo. And his magic that he managed to cast. Before that though, so when they found the skeleton, it did have a very, very slight layer of limestone over it. Because of the environment that is in, it's going to slowly build up limestone as time progresses. So we're thinking that actually helped preserve, because it managed to cement itself on top. So there was no water damage there, so to speak. So it managed to help with the preservation. However, if you were to take that skull and the rest of the skeleton from that water where it's been in that water for 8,000 years, there hasn't been like a massive current going through it as well. It's fresh water. So it doesn't quite have that, it's not moving around. It doesn't have that constant battering of new water hitting it. But if you were to take it out of the water after 8,000 years and just let it dry on the side, it will turn to dust. As soon as you would touch it, it will dry out and you won't be able to do anything. But Geronimo has this, he uses his own protocol to help preserve it, which took him around about 8 to 10 months to do. So it was pulled out and then we had to wait 8 to 10 months before we could even touch it, because it was so fragile. But yeah, so the preservation is good, but it's also bad in the sense that we can't get some analytical stuff out of it, but at least we can touch it.
So yeah, it's one of those things, isn't it? So what do you think the water quality is actually like, if there's quite a lot of, because it makes sense that there's a sediment that builds up over it and, as you say, almost cocoons it over time.
Like, to me, the water quality is fantastic in the cenotes. Like the locals use the cenotes as like swimming baths. It is super clean water. It is fresh. You have salt water and you've got freshwater ones, and they are crystal clear. So the water quality is beautiful. So yeah, it's just, well, it's weird to say that we've got, how many is it? It's 8, 9 skeletons from this one area in Tulum. So then it's odd that in this one focal spot, we've got some of the oldest skeletons, all with these decent preservation. So there must be something in the water.
I was going to say it must be some sort of chemistry in
Some
the
chemistry.
system that has brought together the sort of conditions that have allowed them to actually.
Yeah, and I'll
survive.
put it down to like the current as
Mm.
well. It's not a strong current as well. It's very slow, as in when you're in it, as I've been told by Geronimo, who's in the picture. That's Geronimo picking up the skeleton. The water doesn't feel like it moves. It feels stagnant. So it's just slowly moving. So it's not being battered by anything, and it doesn't have kind of like random stones hitting it or stuff like that. So it doesn't have external damage. But yeah, it's way outside of my area of expertise when it comes to water chemistry.
So how much do you know about honey?
Oh.
There's one from Adam that's saying, I wonder if the cavities were from eating too much honey, because the Yucatan Peninsula is now famous for it.
They really are, which like if we could get that isotopic signature from the teeth, we might have been able to match it to something to then be like, okay, what's isotopic values of honey? You know, like where did they sit with this ratio of chemicals? Can we match that to what we are getting from the teeth in their diet? One of the other things that we tried to do as well is she had a little bit of oh God, I've even forgotten what we call it. Never mind anything else. Plaque on the teeth, but it's so old that it's cemented onto the teeth. It's not nice. She did have some of, yeah. Oh God, you see those videos of everybody getting it removed. She had a bit of that, so we actually took a sample of that as well to see if we could then get an idea of foods she was eating and everything. Again, came up with nothing because of the preservation, because water, it destroys everything.
Yeah.
So sorry about that, but unknown for honey.
There's a couple around about further explanation of the cave system and whether or not you think there'll be more remains to be discovered in that system, or is it well and truly?
Yeah, the difficulty, as in absolutely, like Geronimo normally spends most of his life underwater. I'm not gonna lie. So it's great, and he's always finding things. So if it's not human skeletons, then he's finding giant ground sloths. He's finding rodent remains, the like pedicule, tiny like rodents. He's finding all sorts down there. So they are constantly being looked at. One of the downsides, though, is these cave systems, these labyrinths, are not controlled. So if you don't even need a diver's license, really. But as long as you can dive, you can go in and you can take whatever you find. We did actually have a case. So we've got the image of them, which is Chan Hol 2. We have no idea where Chan Hol 2 is. They were photographed, and then, because normally the process is Geronimo would and the team would dive, they would find it, they would geolocate it, like with GPS and stuff like that. They would then have to come back up, tell the authorities, this is what we found, and then get the go-ahead to go back down to retrieve it. In that time span, if somebody else comes across it, they can take it. And that is sadly what it's been happening. So there may have been 50 skeletons down there, but we just don't know, because they've either been taken or stuff like that. But it's quite a dangerous business, because we've had even experienced divers actually sadly die in the caves because they've taken a wrong turn. Because we're talking kilometers of cave systems, and it's pitch black. So unless you really know what you're doing, I'm never going down there.
There's not a little person in a gondola coming along.
No, the whole thing. Yeah, there is no. There's nobody. So it is a dangerous business, but so it's kind of like a mix. So Geronimo and his team of divers are still going out there because they're part of our project, and they really love doing this stuff because they get to hear what we say about them and to try and pick the pieces. So we're definitely exploring not just the Chan Hol cave system, but a lot of the other systems as well, where we found the other skeletons like Las Palmas and Najaron. They're being fully explored as well. So that's really nice. So there will be more.
That kind of brings us on to the next question is, how do you think they ended up down there?
So we've been throwing around quite a few theories in our group. You know, down to peaceful holiday, stuff like this. But we think as Chan Hol, Ishel is different than any of the others that we found, because Ishel was found with her skull on a limestone bed that was propped up by a stalagmite, which is weird. Like, even you look at it and it's just like, this looks like somebody put her there. And there must have been, and generally in a case of the society, just from looking at Ishel, there had to be some amount of care. That there was a care system in the community, because she would not have survived if she didn't have external help with dealing with those sharp force traumas to the head and that type of stuff. So there was definitely care in the community. So one of the ideas that's been thrown around is, could this be a mortuary site? Could this be like a funeral place, like a cemetery, where this is where they'll just lay the dead to be? Because back when they were alive, the cave system you could walk into, it was perfectly fine. It wasn't flooded. It was a complete bone dry area. So it could well have been a mortuary funeral site, so to speak, which links to, because we saw something very similar, not with a limestone pillow, but we saw some similarities with some stuff that we saw in southern Florida with some of their skeletons that were old as well. And we're like, okay, could be a possibility of shared experience between the two sites. So sadly, no, they didn't drown. It was before the cave was fully underwater. But yeah, we think it was like a mortuary site or something, this funeral place. That's our go-to theory at the moment.
It's definitely an interesting mystery, isn't it? That
like she came with more questions, instead of it being, oh, this is who she is, this is everything else, and then it's just like, oh, but why?
All the best research does, though.
I know, to which my PhD supervisor was Sylvia, and she just goes, this is going to be your career now, Sam. You're going to be stuck here. And I'm like, okay.
If we answered all the questions, life would be boring.
Exactly. That's what I like to say anyway.
So we've got a question from Sheila saying, how's your Spanish?
Oh, thanks, Sheila. Thank you. My Spanish is terrible. I am actively learning Spanish. I go to Spanish classes every week. Because yeah, it is a necessity to speak Spanish. That I'm the place where like these skeletons are found in Tulum. Very lucky in the fact that about 30-minute drive north is you've got a place called Playa de Carmen, which is kind of like the tourist area. So everybody speaks English. So I get very lucky because that's where I stay when I'm there. But yeah, the Spanish is definitely needed, especially when we're going to Costa Rica and Guatemala. Those people, the museum curators, I know full well, they don't speak a word of English. So it's a case of I need to communicate somehow. So yeah, the Spanish is happening slowly.
In among everything else that you've got to do.
Oh, we don't think about that. We don't think about it.
So we've got another question from Matthew. Are the cenotes elsewhere? Cenotes, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine.
It's, Sheila's comment is it's better than hers.
Yeah.
And obviously better than mine at this point. Elsewhere in the world, or are they unique to the area?
So the cenotes are actually a remnant of, we're going into deep time now. They're a remnant
way back.
way back. I don't think you can see the dinosaurs on my shirt, but it actually goes back to the asteroid that hit the Earth and killed all the dinosaurs. I hope there's no paleontologists here because I've most probably butchered their entire area of expertise. But essentially what happened, so these cenotes were kind of created from that impact. So when the asteroid hit, you had all the offshoots happen. So you had then like mini asteroids that hit and created wells. And then with, God, we're talking millions of years, sea level change, up and down, up and down, up and down, they kind of then interconnected with each other underground as the cracks happened and everything like that. So the cenotes in Mexico are very specific to them, whilst you do have equivalents elsewhere. The ones in Mexico are weird in a lovely way, in a really nice way. But as far as I know, like the level of these cenotes, of these like underwater cave systems and these wells are specific to kind of like that area of the Yucatan.
I'll be linked into the geomorphology, won't it? And
yeah, which is Sylvia's and Wolfgang's area of expertise. And I'm like, cool, you tell me about that geology.
Give me a skeleton.
Give me a skeleton, while Wolfgang is asking, give me a dinosaur. So yeah.
Okay, does anybody else have any questions? I'm just having a wait to see if anybody pops in anything else in the chat.
Furiously typing.
But yeah, if there's nothing else, then
Oh, see, Spanish. Thank you, Sheila. Muchas gracias.
But yeah, that's what I was about to say. So if there's nothing else, then all that remains is to say thanks, Sam. That it's been very interesting. I hope everybody enjoyed it, and hopefully we'll see you sometime soon for one of our other events.
Yes.
But yeah, if there's nothing else, then just a great big thank you, Sam.
Thank you very much.
And thank you everybody for coming along. And as I disappear into the darkness in my living room, but it's definitely the year is drawing on. Yeah. But yeah, so thanks a lot, and we'll see you all soon.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you all have a good evening.